Good morning. Today, I want to talk to you about grief and despair. I'm going to break down the story of Adam and Eve, of Cain and Abel. We're going to talk about narcissism. We're going to talk about Jesus. And we're going to bring it home with the last step, which is the key to all of this journey, which is Aphrodite, Urania, or Venus, or compassion, love, humility. So I'm going to share my screen. And if it looks like I'm crying, I was crying this morning because I had sort of my own sort of spiritual ahas. And one of the beautiful things about spiritual ahas is that they can happen anywhere, and they do happen anywhere. They happen in the most unlikely places. They happen in places that you think that you don't belong or want to be anymore. And that's where you get your biggest spiritual lessons and spiritual teachers. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about like narcissism and why we're all narcissists and the Age of Aquarius and what all of this is about. And I struggle with my own narcissism, egomaniac, pride, and all of that. And you know, it's about owning it. That's the whole spiritual striptease. And I will talk about grief and despair in relationship to that. But it's one of the reasons why I love Gurdjieff, the philosopher, so much, because he is like, you don't need to be in an ashram, and you don't need to be in a church or a monastery. You know, spirituality is in the real world. And I just love having those sort of confirmations in a conversation with a colleague that seems to be material and it's spiritual. And that's the beauty of learning to live in sort of both worlds, both the spirit and the matter, which is something I'm going to talk about today, is that you realize that every single material exchange is spiritual and every spiritual exchange is material. These things cannot be separated. And I've been on like this podcasting sort of circuit. And the first question is usually, what's your story? And, you know, I talk about the cult. But the interesting thing is that I was born into a cult that became a cult later. It was actually very strong spiritual philosophy foundation. And I definitely attribute that to who I am and what I do. But one of the big things that was sort of the takeaway was that my father and mother were the material arm to the spiritual sort of foundation of this this cult. And I always learned the importance of spirit and matter being together. Like, I've never struggled with that. I've never struggled with these two sort of identities being one. And that's what I see so much in practice. It's like an either or, and it's usually the spiritual that's sort of the one that's outcast. And that's why I'm going to break down these myths today to sort of try to get us back to that. And that's why in the spiritual adulting map, the last stage, so to speak, is Lilith and the spiritual striptease, which I talked to you about last week. But then I also told you you have to go right back down to Venus. So I've got the prostitute poster, and that's the I'm equal to you. I am divine, just like you. I will not be submissive to another human being, which is the whole dethroning idea. No one should be on your throne. You are the king of your castle. You are the person in charge of your life. But then you have to bring it back down to Venus. You have to bring it to the heart center. You have to bring it to loving kindness. The thing is, we're going about it all wrong. And that's the problem. So it has to be this unraveling and discussing grief and despair and where they come from, viewing the spirit and matter always together. Then you can get to the heart space, to the loving kindness and the consideration and the compassion. You can't do it the way we're doing it. It's on false premise. So that's part of my objective for today. So the universal law that I want to talk about is the principle of mentalism and the law of gender and the principle of correspondence. So first is the principle of mentalism. I've said this before, that human beings, we cannot understand the vastness of this universe, and we cannot understand the vastness of ourselves. Like we do not comprehend. This law says all is mind. It's all mental. It's all happening in here. We're creating all of this. This is our capacity. This is our greatness. This is the agency we have, and we just don't. So the law of gender, which is like the sixth chakra, which is God as form, or the illusion in form, is sort of the most that we can get to. So that's why I say that. It's very easy to understand gender or qualities that we attribute to sort of qualities to people, and whether it's masculine and feminine. Again, not from a sexual standpoint, but from an energetic or vibrational standpoint. There are characteristics that we would define as such. And also from a unity standpoint, I've shared with you before, the raising of the Kundalini, or the Ida and the Pingala of the Caduceus, reaches unity. We can only be unified when there's a balance of spirit and matter, masculine and feminine. If not, other than that, we're living as dual. And that's the point of today, to sort of talk about these things. So there are 7 planes in the universe. Now, it's difficult, again, for us to understand that the universe is cyclical and it's a hierarchical. So it's like when we think of planes, we think of hierarchy, but it's cyclical. So we view things in a hierarchy, like the way that our chakras are set up, in order, or an organization is set up. But really, it's all cyclical. And this goes in alignment with the principle of mentalism, how difficult it is to understand this. And the 7th plane, the highest plane, is the monadic plane. And actually, in the diagram, everything's sort of in a hierarchy, except you see the monad as a circle, because we're all one. It's the circular sort of reference to the universe. So I have a metaphor that I use, and I've been using this for years, is this metaphor of a cookie dough. So if you get cookie dough, even just like a Pillsbury or a Nestle Toll House, it comes like in a log. It's a big mass, kind of like this picture. And what do? You can't stick the whole log of cookie dough in the oven. You have to put it into little nuggets like this, like little, droplets on the pan. So this is the universe. This is the principle of mentalism. The universe is a big batch of cookie dough. And this is us, all these individual people, but we come from the universe. We come from the divine. We have that consciousness within us. We have the divine within us. The thing is, we feel limited because we're only like a little plop of that universal consciousness or universal energy, castrated and limited, we think, by this body. And the point is to understand that the body is not limiting us. Our mind is limiting us. Our body's housing the dwelling of this God, of this divine in us. And if we don't come and do our divine job, we're sort of, hurting the world from getting us and experiencing this. And so I'll use the Adam and Eve of God in his image related to this sort of cookie dough analogy. So this brings me to the principle of correspondence. I absolutely love this law and live my life with this law. This law states, as above, so below. Everything that's happening in this earthly realm is happening in the higher realms, in the higher planes. It's all manifested as it's exactly supposed to be. So when we're having major social justice movements or climate change issues or transgender communities growing, this is all manifestation of these spiritual laws that we can't access. Of the 7 planes, we can only access up to the 4th plane, which is the Akashic plane. The other 3 planes we don't have access to, but this law allows us to know what's sort of happening in the mind of God or the universal consciousness that we are part from. We are never, ever, ever separated from that source. The idea that being born into a body is a limitation is false. It's just the only way that we get to express the divine consciousness, the big cookie dough, in our sort of small space. And we understand that the treatment of our body, the treatment of others changes because we understand that it's just a correspondence. The other part of the adage is, as within, so without. Every single thing that is happening to you externally is a manifestation or representation of what's happening internally. That's why if you learn to live in the material world and understand that everything materially that's happening is a spiritual lesson or is a spiritual sort of message to you, it's just your whole life changes. And this is what shamans say, that we live between the worlds. We've got one foot in the earthly, one foot in the spiritual. So I always refer to myself as earthly Francis or spiritual Francis. Spiritual Francis understands, but earthly Francis doesn't, let's say. And these two have got to get along. This is the unity. This is the unified self. This is what we're aspiring to create in the world. We have to understand that we have two states of being. We have an earthly being and a spiritual being. And unless these two get along, are in unison, we will not be balanced individuals and we will be in pain. Now, I will talk to you about grief today as the earthly representation of the state of being of earth or your matter, and despair being your spiritual state of being, and how to bring your grief into despair so that you can honor your spiritual work. So I want to briefly start off with one myth, and we will cover a few, but Hercules, Hera was tricked into believing that Hercules was her son. And I use Hercules because Hercules' 12 labors are where my 12 truths of a spiritual path are based on. The astrological wheel, if you teach esoteric astrology the way I do, you use these myths. They're very, very powerful. And so Hercules is simply the hero that Joseph Campbell talks about in The Hero's Journey. And that's us. And he's a demigod, half mortal, as are we. The God part is the divine, and the mortal part is the fact that we're in an earthly body that has earthly needs and requirements. So Hera was giving Hercules the boob, and she realized that he wasn't hers, and she rips out the boob and creates the Milky Way from that milk. This is the same thing. When we have the realization that we're not just earthly, that we don't want the toxic waters, the low level of vibration and consciousness from the womb, the shadow love language from the womb, then we can actually look up and realize that the Milky Way, our galaxy and beyond, is in us, and we're that. And this metaphor of the cookie dough, the universal consciousness, and that we're just housed in this body so that we could do our work, because you cannot do your spiritual work without a body. When you leave the body and you go into the higher planes of the universe, you're just at rest. You're not burning karma. You're not moving forward spiritual progress until you reincarnate again and take in another cookie dough, another body. So it's important to understand that the body is the only way that we can actually do our divine work in the world. So when Alcime was going to give birth to Hercules, Hera didn't want Hercules to be born. There was a midwife who was instructed by Hera to hold Alcime's vagina so he wouldn't be born. But Galinthia caught on, she was the other midwife, and she tricked Hera and the other midwife and said, oh, the baby's been born. And Hera loses sight, gets distracted, and out comes Hercules. This is so important. You are meant to be here. You might have been planned, unplanned, an accident, unintended, as most babies are, but you are meant to be here. Your cookie dough, your divine spark needs to be here. This notion that we are not meant to be, or we were not loved, or we're not wanted, is from an earthly perspective. It's the story that keeps you in child, that keeps you victim, that keeps you from doing your divine mission in the world. We are all Hercules, and we are all wanted here. So what happens is Galinthia gets turned by Hera into a cat. And I love this, that Marie von Franz has a book called The Symbolism of Cats. But in a nutshell, the cat is independence. The cat is itself. That's one of the things that people say, I don't like cats, I like dogs. My dog's loyal, my dog is always with me. But the cat does his own thing. And it's the individuation process. Yes, you had to trick, let's say, your parents to conceive you, to give you the body, but that's it. You're here to do your job. Turn yourself into a cat, be independent, be individualized, so that the whole world can see your spark, can see the universal consciousness through you. Every single one of us, no matter what our place in the world, is here to bring some divine message. It might just be to a colleague. It might just be the person at the gas station. It doesn't have to be this big, huge, oh my God, earth-shattering existence that, that you're writing books and spreading messages that reaches millions of people. But you are here for a reason, for one real specific reason. You needed to be born. Your manifestation of that cookie dough has to be here. And I love this myth for that reason. So I want to talk to you today about Adam and Eve. This has been so misinterpreted. And so I'm kind of going to break down the myth for you. In Adam and Eve, the language says that they were made in his image. His image means to the form, the divine, but put into a form. That was it. That's the simple explanation of what that is. So at heart, we're all narcissists. And I have that on the board. And we have to talk about this reality that we all know that we're God, that we're all narcissists at heart. And stop playing small or stop burning everything we come in contact with. And accept that fact that we are God. God put into a body. That's the idea of made in his image. So at heart, we're all narcissists and we know we're divine. And all we're trying to do is play small and pretend that we're not. And so we're trying to live from a heart center without ever owning that we're Lilith, that we're the prostitute, that we've ripped off the veils, that we've owned that we're equal to God, that we're not going to be in submission anymore. You cannot come to the fourth chakra, to the divine feminine of the love thy neighbor if you haven't reached the love thyself. And you cannot love thyself unless you've done the second chakra work of understanding that you're power hungry, that you're a glutton, that you're envious, and all of the thieves that I've spoken to you about. So what we do is we struggle with this reality and we pretend that we're not God, and then we act good. It's all a facade. It's not true. You've got to understand the deep down, dirty, earthly existence. If you need to pee and poop and have sex and eat and sleep every day, then you also have lust and envy and gluttony and pride. It's like pretending that we're not of the matter makes it goes away. That's one of the functions of illness. I'm beyond the body. So let me get sick in the body to remind myself that I am limited and I am humble, rather than just owning that we are divine and we are God. So how are gods really animals? How is Jesus born in a manger? How are all the gods of Olympus whores and drunks and beasts? Because that's what we are. We're both. This is repeated in mythology and religion, and we've got to stop the nonsense pretending that we're not both. It's only with that we're actually going to reach the divine feminine, which is the whole purpose of the spiritual adulting, to come back to Venus, the spirit over matter, not even over, balanced, that we're both of these things. So we see this repeated with Jesus in the manger, gods on the Olympus doing atrocities. We're all made in his image because we all are divine, the universal cookie dough, the universal consciousness, but limited into a form. So this notion of Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden, it's just been so misinterpreted. So Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden for eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This is what it says in the scriptures. The tree of knowledge is a metaphor for limitations in rational thinking. If we only think that our mind, that our intellect, that our earthly form, getting validated through the material or the intellectual, of course, we're sort of kicked out. The Adam and Eve, the myth or the symbolism, excuse me, of the Garden of Eden is the cookie dough, the universal cookie dough. You limit yourself when you only stay at rational mind. I went out to dinner with some friends yesterday, and he's writing a book for skeptics that don't believe in the woo-woo. There's nothing woo-woo about this. There's nothing woo-woo about me. There's nothing woo-woo about understanding that we're divine, that we have a spirit that animates us, and that spirit leaves, or that prana leaves, and our body dies. That's it. Where's the woo-woo in understanding the truth that we are spiritual and material all at once? So it's interesting. We limit ourselves. We kick ourselves out of this metaphorical Garden of Eden or universal consciousness. The tree of knowledge is a delight to the eye, the scriptures say. I've told you before, what enters the eyes is limited. What enters the eyes robs your fire from your third chakra. It's the form, it's the illusion. I am going to talk to you later about what ways to use the muses, the eyes, to get closer to God rather than to harm yourself and feel separate from God. Again, God isn't a guy on the sky on a throne. God, I'm referring to the universal consciousness, the universal energy, the big cookie dough, and the divine or the God within. So it's from form or anything that enters the eyes that keeps you separate from your own divinity. What I have on the board: lust, greed, envy, gluttony. You judge that about yourself, consciously or subconsciously. That keeps you from loving yourself, keeps you from your divinity, keeps you from doing what you need to do in the world because you think that isn't godly. That's very godly. It's the earthly part, but it should only be 48 to 52 of your existence. The other 48 to 52 should obviously be dedicated to more spiritual values or a spiritual life. So I have spiritual values as boundaries, limits, 48 to 52, and hard edges, oftentimes called cold-blooded. I simply call spiritual adulting. So you're going to see today, I'm going to distinguish grief as an earthly nature. I have that here. Your earthly is grief, and it's linked to utility. When you use someone or something, it's earthly, and grief is earthly. There is a point in the grief process that can lead you to despair. Despair is your spiritual growth. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Rational thinking is duality. Rational thinking is grief. Thinking you are only here in the earthly realm, in an earthly existence, leads to grief. When you feel you have lost something. I have on the board possess and possessions. We are all possessing things and people as a sign of self-worth, and it isn't true. This leads to grief when this is taken from us, and I'll get into that later. Good and evil is everything and in everything. There is nothing that doesn't have good in it, and there's nothing that doesn't have evil in it. There's an Ayurvedic proverb that says medicine is poison in excess and poison is medicine in, I don't know the specific Sanskrit words, but it's like medicine can be poison and poison can be medicine. And that's sort of the concept of homeopathy as well. So there's everything. So to believe that you only have to live as half a person in your good, which isn't good, it's fake, it's that conventional morality I've talked to you about, is castrating half of yourself, is castrating your superior self. So you've got a superior self, that big cookie dough, the universal consciousness or the divine in you. And you also have an inferior self, which is the body, the limitation, the fact that you have earthly needs, this lust and greed as much as food and using the bathroom. You need to get kicked out of the superior self into the inferior self to get back home. You have to leave the big cookie dough. You have to leave the universal consciousness, take on a body, burn your karma here, learn your lessons here so that you can get back home at your last breath when you die and leave the body. So grief and despair are the ways to get there. There's sort of the return home, oftentimes found in illness, which you see in the spiritual adulting map. Chiron is the wound. You don't need to get ill, but oftentimes we have illness, whether it's physical or mental. leads you to Lilith, the spiritual striptease, that leads you back home to Venus, which is the balance of the inferior and the superior self, or the earth, spirit and matter, or the earthly and the spiritual, so that you can then live from a space of agape love or Aphrodite Urania in your heart chakra. This is the process back home, and it's only in a body that you can get there. Adam and Eve were said that they lost their innocence. I will lead this to despair later. This was their nakedness. When they stopped being truthful, when they started getting more enamored with illusion, with the earthly realm, the serpent, all the serpent means in mythology is illusion. You're just enamored with illusion of what you want it to be and want it to look like. That's it. So when they got more identified with the matter, aka the body, or the tree, the rational mind, the knowledge, the intellect, they lost their nakedness. So part of our spiritual journey home is to get naked again, naked with the truth, the spiritual striptease, so we can get back home to ourselves, and of course, back home to the universal consciousness. They started wearing veils. When we start wearing veils at the moment of conception, we've already got kicked out of the universal consciousness, and we lost our innocence. And so a lot of us, and that's why Erickson's first stage, trust versus mistrust, told you a couple weeks back, ask the client, did you get here okay? Do you know how to navigate directions, or do you not? Do you want to have a trusting view or a mistrusting view? They're all linked to the innocence. I'm either going to live as the perpetrator and have no innocence, which is the same, the opposite's the same, or I'm going to live as the innocent in the snow globe when really I'm the perpetrator, and it's the same thing. So that's all that was. Your identification with more of the earthly realm, with more of the illusion of what enters your eyes rather than your own self-worth and your own divine nature, is the only thing that got you kicked out of your innocence, and what got you kicked out of the Garden of Eden. The serpent tricked Eve into eating the apple. The serpent, again, is symbolic of illusion. You see it with Moses and the staff, turns to a snake. You see this with the Ida and the Pingala in the Caduceus. You see this with Kundalini. You see this with the Garden of Hesperides in mythology with Hercules and the dragon. And the best symbol is the one of Erebos, which is the snake eating its tail, where it's wholeness, because you're both, you're the head and the tail. That's the wheel of Pisces. You're the head of Aries with the tail of Pisces, and you come full circle. That's how you get home, only acknowledging that you are enamored with the illusion, you are enamored with the earthly realm, but you're going to live spiritually within that, you know, sort of live unified in the sixth chakra, the law of gender. You're going to raise both your masculine and your feminine qualities, your spirit and matter, and you're going to live whole in the earthly realm. That's the point. The eyes are simply lust, greed, envy, and form, the illusion of form. So here I have the tree of life from Kabbalah. And tree of life, it says, when you unify matter and spirit, you can eat from the tree of life. Literally the tree of life from the Garden of Eden. But here's the tree of life in Kabbalah. And I want to concentrate on this triangle here. So this is Keter, which is the crown, which is your way back home to God and to yourself, to the universal cookie dough. And here you have understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. This is what keeps us from getting back home. Most of us live in the knowledge Sephiro. We understand this from a knowledge, a rational thinking, an intellect. The head goes back to that myth I shared with you of Metis the Titan, eaten by Zeus, birthed Athena, the rational mind, the wisdom of the logic. But it was Hephaestus that cracked the helmet open. It was Hephaestus that brings you to touch the universal consciousness. That's the wisdom we need. Only when you take knowledge, you understand it. I call this head to heart in my 7 Gates book. When you bring it to the understanding and you bring it to the wisdom, then it's head to heart. That's when it's wisdom. That's when you can get home to Keter, or the crown, your third chakra, your throne. So it's very important. The other thing is that Adam and Eve had shame. There was a lot of shame. Are you aware that the first instance in your childhood that you can link to shame is what you built your entire story on? When you grieve, that's what you're grieving. And so I'm going to take that to despair later. So let's talk about the children of Adam and Eve. So this brings me to the triad. Your mom and dad are Adam and Eve, and you're the firstborn, Cain. Okay, Cain kills Abel. So they're the first children of Adam and Eve. If you're kicked out of Olympus, if you're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, then obviously you're a product of that. And we have difficulty reconciling this. That's why our parents, whether they're quote unquote good or bad, it doesn't matter at the moment of conception, because they had you and they limited you with rational thinking, limitations of needs, shortage of unconditional love, all of these things that represent the universal consciousness. The minute they conceive you, that's the impure thought. I am not enough. It's linked to whatever they're dealing with, but it's literally shame. And it's literally that you are limited and you have now been castrated or kicked out of Olympus or kicked out of the Garden of Eden because you've been given this limiting form. And so we hate ourselves. At a root, we have major self-hatred and self-betrayal because of this body. And we will do anything to destroy the body, the 0 to 100, or only glorify the body. And that's the myth of Cain and Abel. So Cain is a farmer. Cain represents the earth element, the body. And Abel is a shepherd. Shepherd is symbolic for the ether. That's why Jesus was the shepherd. So it's the ether or the universal consciousness. It's the spirit that's housed within the body. So what this myth is all about is Adam and Eve, your parents, created you in both a spiritual form and an earthly form. And over and over and over again, we choose the earthly form. We murder our spirituality. We murder our Abel. Do not get convinced that if you are a spiritual person and you're hiding out in a monastery or an ashram or you're in retreats all day, that you're not being earthly. You're absolutely being earthly. Earthly has nothing to do with the form. Spiritual has nothing to do with the form. It has to do with doing this inner work of getting down and dirty and reaching this Aphrodite Urania. So it's not what it looks like. We've got to get away from what it looks like. That is the castration. That is the illusion. That's exactly why Adam and Eve got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So Cain murders Abel. You murder your divine self. Your divine self is trapped in the body. So you don't want to recognize that you're God because, then you'll be a narcissist, so let's play small. So I'd say, let's just get it all in the open. We're all narcissists, egomaniacs, prideful, and gluttons and so forth. We think we're better than God, just like Lucifer, or that we are God. And we feel trapped in the body. So we castrate or we murder our divine being so that our fire doesn't shine bright, for fear of having it so uncontrolled that we won't be able to control it. We play small. So our divine nature, our Abel, is limited and murdered by the body, the form, the illusion, all of the material realm. This is your castration. Cain is cursed, and this is all in the story of the Bible. No, there's no such thing. You will try and kill your divinity, kill your inner fire, third chakra, pretend you don't think you are God, narcissistic, in the name of social convention. Put that away. That's not allowed. Meet others' needs. Be nice to people. Disregard yourself. This is the secret language that we're taught in society, in the home. No one believes it, but this is how we live our life, and we're constantly murdering our spirituality and our divinity. So curse, the word curse actually means wrath. Every single one of us has wrath. First of all, the Old Testament God is a wrathful God. If you're God and a narcissist, you too are wrathful. You're wrathful that others exist. You're wrathful that someone has more than you. Again, the eyes, greed and envy and lust and wrath all come in through the eyes, the form. The curse is you, it's yourself. There are a lot of traditions that talk about black magic and witchcraft. those practices only quote unquote work if you believe in that, because you are at that same vibration. You're doing it to yourself. Therefore, someone can sort of throw you a chicken or whatever the heck they do, and you say that they did some witchcraft on you. It's you who are cursing yourself for being limited in a body. And you castrate your divinity for not wanting to own the divinity, for fear of it being narcissistic and burning everything in your wake. That's what this is. This is not a curse that anyone has on them. It's the curse you did to yourself when you realized you were limited by the form and you were just one little plop on the cookie dough tray. You're mad at God for not accepting your sacrifice. That was the story of Cain and Abel. Cain's sacrifice to God was not accepted, and Abel's was. So that was the reason that he supposedly in the story killed Abel, which is that you are God and you are angry that you were limited in the body. Stop sacrificing things to God. He doesn't want them. You are the God. You are the one who wants what you want. Stop pretending that. These sacrifices and offerings that we give our parents, the offerings are necessary because they keep us humble. There's a reason why commandment 5, which number 5 is the number of man, which takes us to the whole man in 10. There's a reason it says obey mother and father. It's not obeying in the way that we've misinterpreted the Bible. It's simply honor that you're limited with the consciousness level, with the thoughts, emotions, desires, and values that your parents gave you. Work within that orchard. Don't try to think that you're a pear when you're really born an apple. So that's the importance of that commandment. It's also the importance of mother and father. On your throne, your 6th chakra, there is a petal that's a sun for father and a moon for mother. You have to understand that you are limited in this lifetime by what those two people that you chose at that vibration gave you. And yes, do your divine journey, but within the confines of that. Okay, so it's not pretending that you're not that. That's where the offerings come in. The offerings are healthy in the sense that you're acknowledging that if you're going to go deeper, you got to give Sharon an opal in his mouth to channel you around the river Styx, and you're going to have your death process and then come back. So from Greek mythology. So give your offerings. That's why the gods would give the offerings. I mean, the humans would give the gods an offering of cake or something small. Stop with the sacrifice. The sacrifice that you're doing in life is you're castrating yourself. You're not living your divine light. You're not coming to do what you came to do in the name of sacrificing your entire existence for God. It's not true. You're sacrificing everything in the name of not wanting to honor your spirituality for fear that your narcissism and your pridefulness might be found out in the open. We're all narcissists and we're all prideful. That's considered like the deadliest of sins is pride. And so we try to fake it with humility, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So just accept you are the body and accept that you are spirit once and for all. Can we just get it out in the open that we're all gods and we're all human? We all poop, we all sleep, we all need to eat. What makes you think that you don't need to give your spirit its food every day too? And it's not by pretending that you love someone or that you're kind or that you feel guilty for someone. That isn't true. That isn't the way that you honor your spirituality or your divine nature. Cain is considered the first murderer. The first murder is the fact that you're limited in the body. Evil, violence, greed. All of these are the ways that you murder your divinity. You judge your thieves or deadly sins or shadrupus or vices in such a severe way that it kills your divinity. You think that that's all you are. That is what you need to be 50%, 48 to 52 is human. Therefore, you cannot eliminate these aspects. So you're the murderer of your divine, of your Abel. It's towards yourself and towards others. When you think others are less than you, when you think you are greater than others, you're missing a huge opportunity of the law of correspondence to show you a mirror if someone is showing you something. We pretend we aren't God, or we pretend we're not greedy or lustful. and we hide it with this lens of humility that no one's buying. And go back to the triangle. Cain is the third human. And so mother, father, child. It's because you came as a child that you castrate yourself. And it's linked to the thought, of course, of impurity at the moment of conception that led to you and your imperfection. So in mythology, you have Saturn or Kronos and Pluto or Dispater or Hades. We've talked all month about Pluto and the crime and the criminal and all the myths. Now let's just take it to Saturn and Pluto. Saturn is the father of Pluto. Ops was the mother. So Pluto, which is the criminal, which is the one that's going to bring all these thieves to the light, which is the precursor to the striptease, which is what's going to disrupt your emotional and psychological homeostasis so that you can finally stop the nonsense of being a child, has parents that are the castrator or the castrated, so to speak, Saturn, and the darkness, night, the mother. This happens in silence. This happens in the dark. You do not do spiritual work. You do it in the world, obviously, but the inner process, the inner work is done alone in your own space. There's nobody that walks you down that journey. Yes, you could have teachers and gurus and classes and workshops and books, but this is an internal process. It's called the dark night of the soul for a reason. So Saturn's role is to give you small deaths every 7 years, the nemesis years, the valor years. I've talked to you at length about this, to get you to detach and to die along the way. I have here, learning to die is the lesson of life. Saturn is the one that most frequently shows up to teach you how to die. He attempts to teach you detachment. He gives you small deaths. I love this idea of boredom. Boredom in Buddhism is actually a path to self-awareness. I had a client the other day saying, my kid is always saying she's bored. And I'm like, give her an emotions wheel. Have her identify truly what she's feeling. We don't want to do that. We don't want to get uncomfortable with our emotions. So we say hunger and then maybe we go eat or we go get distracted. Boredom is an indicator that you need to go deeper. Saturn slows time, literally slows time during Saturn cycles so that you could get really uncomfortable and bored that you have to go within. So these are the small attempts of the psyche that you create every 7 years to try to do deeper work. The problem is that we don't always get there. So you'd rather grieve than sit with your thoughts. I'm going to go into grief more in depth in a moment. This is an important lesson. Saturn is utility. Everybody has Saturn somewhere. Everybody has Capricorn cusp, and everyone has a Capricorn decanat. If you think that you are beyond using people, places, and things, you're in total denial. All we do is use. Every single thing is a utility. It's usually a utility for us to stay in child, try to get our needs met. You are simply in grief when you got dumped or that person died or you got fired. The utility, you weren't done using that person, place, thing, or situation, and you call it grief. This is an earthly world issue. This is directly linked to your earthly matter, your body. Despair is a spiritual illness. That's different. It is through your grief, your earthly existence, that you can get into despair and then do your spiritual work. But do not think that grief is anything more than utility, that you haven't finished using that person, place, thing, or situation for what you need. Because we're all children and we all possess things and people as an identity to our self-worth, as a link to our self-worth. What becomes of no use to you any longer? Ask yourself that. Don't stay past an expiration date. Just own that that utility of that person, place, thing, or situation is no longer of use to you. I had an editor say to me, well, this is cold-blooded. And I said, no, it's called spiritual adulting. Be honest. If you no longer need to get your needs met, you're going to lose things. That's just the reality of growth. Can you admit that you're a user? Can you admit that you're a utilitarian? That you simply have people, places, and things in your life is you need to use them. And can you admit that when someone gets rid of you first, and I'm even talking death. I had a client the other day, I said, yeah, you weren't done using your husband when he dropped dead. Doesn't mean that the grief isn't real. It's an earthly requirement. It's part of the earthly process. But let's not call it what it is. We haven't finished utilizing that. And it's an earthly possession. People too. All roles end. This is a big function of Saturn, is to teach you, because the word for Saturn, the word for Capricorn is utility, duty, utility. So all roles end, even motherhood. Anything you stay past a due date, past a role, is just extending an expiration date. It's causing frustration. Don't do it. It hurts you and the other person. Now, when you can't learn Saturn cycles, when you can't learn that things have expired, that you have to end things, that utility no longer serves you, Pluto kicks in. You create a Pluto, you create a major catastrophic situation to help you detach. Sudden loss, no ending, closure, no closure. We've talked at length about that this week. We call this grief. It is an attempt towards despair. Again, your earthly self, your material castrated self, is grief. Grief is an earthly condition, whereas despair is a spiritual condition. We want to use grief to lead us to the spiritual condition of despair so we could do our spiritual work and stop killing off our divine. But we can get stuck in the psychological homeostasis, grieve the 2-year period, and go right back into the toxic waters. We don't necessarily get led to despair if we don't do the work. So it's an attempt towards despair when Saturn didn't get through to you. Saturn here eating his children doesn't get through to you that here's Pluto, here's Hades with Cerberus, the 3-headed dog, making you look at your thoughts, your emotions, and your desires, starting with the spiritual TED Talk so that you are forced to look at yourself. That does not mean that you're always going to do that. Unfortunately, people use and lose the opportunity of grief to lead them to despair and their spiritual growth. What do you lose if you truly acknowledge your worth? With self-worth, with self-love, inevitably, people, places, things, situation leave your life. Because we love to possess people and things, we're not willing to do our inner work for fear of losing something. It just comes part and parcel with spirituality. It's very well known in the spiritual literature that this path could be very lonely, because you realize that you outgrow things, or people outgrow you, or the utility is no longer good, that it just goes away. And so what are you holding on to? What are you not willing to lose so that you don't have self-worth for fear of, gaining this greater part of yourself? Worth is simply self. Self-worth is simply self. That's it. It's simply your brilliant diamond, your love of self, your divine nature. So we have possessions and we possess. If you cannot let go of your possessions or what you possess, it will be taken with you through a Pluto. Pluto does not care. Pluto is your begging, your prayer to the universe. When you say you pray so hard, that's what you're praying for. Something to disturb the status quo, something to shift you into consciousness. Don't waste it. You created it. It came into your life. Don't waste it. We call this in spirituality a dark night of the soul. What you're doing is you're grieving people and possessions. You're grieving because there was a utility in that, and now it's no longer useful, but you weren't done with that person or place, and that's what you're grieving. Do not think it's anything else beyond that. Astronomy. In the sky, there is a star named Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the sky. The 3 wise men were said to be following Sirius over here. And the 3 stars of Orion represent the big pyramids in Giza and represent the wise men that were following the brightest star, which announced Jesus's birth. It's called the dog star or the God star. The dog star because it's the dog days of summer. I've told you before that the constellation of Cancer is the beehive or the honeypot, the low-level consciousness, the manger. So it announces that you, God, have to be born in the manger, in the honeypot, in the low-level consciousness. And to get out of the manger and get to the Christ consciousness in Capricorn, you have to go through the spiritual truths. It also represents that it's a scorcher. The dog days of summer means a scorcher. Burn what you're not. I've told you before, you're a brilliant diamond, third chakra, layered with thoughts, emotions, and desires and low-level consciousness that I say is honey. And you have to burn all that away. You have to purify that so that your brilliance can shine. That's the divine light. That's the divine fire. That's the soul. That's the soul's purpose. That's the divine will that you're afraid of. Because if that gets so brilliant, you might think you're God and admit to the world that you're a narcissist. It's also the Star of Bethlehem, which is the Christmas star. Again, you're born in Cancer, the mass consciousness, low-level consciousness of your parents, to reach the Christmas star, which is the Christ consciousness. It has nothing to do with Christmas. Both Saturn was celebrated at Christmas in the Saturnalia, and Jesus, neither were Capricorns, so to speak. It also means glowing in Greek. This is you. You are the brightest star in your solar system. You are the brightest star in you, yet you're constantly opaquing that and taking out that light. This star marked the flooding of the Nile in Egypt. The Nile is what gave prosperity to the Egyptians, is what the crops would grow. Without this star, without the rising of this star, the world ceases to be bright because you're not in it. Stop dimming your light. And on a New Age theme, it has 7 stars called the Pleiades, and it transmits the 7 rays. That's for another class. That could also be linked to the 7 planes of the universe. So the stages of grief. Kubler-Ross's stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance. I've shared with you before that grief actually starts at the moment of conception, when you're kicked out of heaven, the universal consciousness, the big cookie dough, the Garden of Eden. So the reason it's grief is because that's when you're given your earthly form. So grief is an earthly disease. Grief is an earthly manifestation. It does not exist in the spirit world. The spirit realm is despair, which we'll talk about. So part of what happens with grief is that you use the grief. And again, this is not to minimize that grief doesn't exist. I was in grief for 3 years on a couch. It's that if we don't want to sit with our thoughts, emotions, and desires, our low consciousness, what we really think about, we'll never get out of that to become the Sirius, to become the divine, to become the Christ consciousness. So we use the pain of the grief, the anger, the denial, the bargaining, why me, why not you? So that we can stay in our sort of low-level consciousness and not really sit with our thoughts. Grief well done leads you to the reality of your utility, of the reality that you possess, the reality that you have an earthly consciousness, and can lead you to the divine consciousness of despair. Grief is human earthly consciousness. Grief is deep sorrow, a loss in the physical realm. You lost something physical, a person, place, thing, or situation you were not done using yet. It can lead you to the spirit. It can lead you to doing your divine work, your spiritual work. But if you don't experience in the earthly realm, then you may not ever get to the divine. That's why I said those Saturn cycles are there, nudging and nudging and nudging and nudging. But a lot of times, most people just don't really get it, that a Pluto has to come in and say, I'm taking this from you. You're going to be forced to look at this. And you can even pilfer that experience. So you forget your God. You use it as a smokescreen to pretend that you're not, that you didn't create all of this, and then you get right back into your vicious cycle of the psychological homeostasis. I have a theory of 5 types of despair. One despair is called delusional despair. It's where you choose, are you going to be human and live a human earthly existence and hate yourself and self-betray and live half a person, or are you going to live both a spiritual divine existence and an earthly existence? This is what Jesus and Buddha came to teach. If you stay in your delusional despair, which I'll explain momentarily, then you simply stay in your grief process. But it's the grief process that leads you to delusional despair that makes you decide to choose a path. Who would you be without your story, and what would you lose? In my 7 gates, the 3rd step is, what need does it fulfill when something happens in your life that causes problems? What are you proving? What happens when you stop proving that you're not worthy? What happens when you stop proving that you're unlovable? What happens when you start proving that you're not really lazy? What are you holding on to with that story? Just your earthly consciousness, and not wanting to be divine, and not wanting to do divine in this limited form. You utilize when you are done. Notice that if you break up, or you lose the job because you quit, you're in power. It's a power struggle. It's a power issue. I have finished utilizing you, causes no grief. Same loss on paper. You still broke up, you still got divorced, you still lost the job. But it's when you're done with the utility that the grief process sets in. And it's done when I'm done leaving the universal consciousness. You didn't decide, quote unquote, God kicked you out. It was time again to now burn karma, a limitation, that you go into grief. But that's really at the soul level, which is despair. So hidden truths, the types of despair. This is my theory of hidden truths and despair. Despair is utter hopelessness. It is a loss without meaning. At the root, we don't really understand. Our divine, our soul, our spirit does not understand why we need an earthly body. Why do we get extracted from the universal cookie dough? We don't get that. We surely don't understand, because we don't have access to the higher planes, why we needed to leave God, why we needed to use the universal womb and the universal consciousness to do it in this body. That's what we feel at the moment of conception. That's why the river of forgetfulness in the Greek mythology. You have to forget everything prior and just live in this world. But we know more. We know that we're the universe. We know that we're divine, and we struggle. Despair is a spiritual disease. It is spiritual consciousness. It's knowing you're the divine, but how do you do it in this body, limited, pooping and peeing and sleeping? Makes no sense. This is the root of all conundrums. Despair is spiritual grief for being in the physical realm. You have no worth or meaning in a body, is what you think, because you haven't really understood the wisdom of the heart, from the head to the heart, that the only way to burn karma, grow spiritually, return home to the universal cookie dough, is through this physical body. That's where illness serves as a narcissistic tendency. Illness means I am beyond the body. Let me hurt and destroy the vessel, the vehicle of my divine being, because I don't need it. It's really crazy when you really think about it. So I've delineated 5 types of despair. There's universal despair. This is when you leave heaven. This is when you leave God. This is when you're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. This is at the moment of conception. There's separateness despair when you leave the womb, when you have your birth. This is when you identify in your consciousness you are separate. Usually the babies are put on the mother's body to identify that their body is different from their mother's. We know that we are no longer part of that supposed symbiotic relationship, which is more parasitic, but what we internalize to be the equal of the universal consciousness. So it's a double whammy. You get out of the universal cookie dough, and now you get out of the womb. You're like just beat down. Of course it's sorrow. Of course it's hopelessness. It's a loss without meaning. Why? The third despair is innocence despair, which is when you have your first sexual experience. This could be masturbation, this could be intercourse, or this can be just petting and touching, whatever you feel is your first sexual experience, is when you experience innocent despair. The biggie here, The biggie, what I was talking about before, is delusional despair. This is when you leave your snow globe. This is when you leave your toxic waters. This is when you leave the emotional and psychological homeostasis, and you've got Pluto that shatters that, disrupts the system for you. You ask for it, your curse, so that you can learn to navigate grief and bring it into despair so that you get to make a choice. Delusional despair is the bridge between the earthly consciousness and the divine consciousness. And you choose, do I want to stay linked to the earthly world, the world of form, the world of illusion, the world of grief, the world of possessions, or do I actually want to go into my spiritual divine light and decide to make change? This is the key, this delusional despair. Every single one of us. Now, if you're lucky enough to really get it with the Saturn cycles and you can avoid a Pluto, no one can avoid a Pluto ever. We all have something, some worse than others, depending on our level of consciousness. But if you get these small steps along the way with Saturn, this delusional despair can be a little less for you. Mine was obviously very disastrous and destructive because I needed a big wake-up call. And then our last despair is when we leave the body, ironically, and we go back to the universal cookie dough, the universal consciousness, and we're leaving the body. That terminal despair is linked directly to how you transition in phases. It's linked to your birth story. I was fast and furious. I burned through everything. If I do that again, I will suffer upon my death. I have to slow down, take a breath, pause. That's my birth story. We have to do it differently so that leaving the body, the terminal despair, isn't so severe. So I'm not the only one that has gotten to these conclusions. I say them in my language, in my way, and I expound on some of these philosophers. So Søren Kierkegaard said in his book, Sickness Unto Death, despair doesn't affect a person, it affects a self. That's the same way of saying that it's a spiritual disease. Remember, you're brilliant diamond covered in honey. All of the honey, all of the worthlessness, all the unmet needs, all the conditional love, the Costco membership, that low-level consciousness of the manger that you got from your parents is simply that you're not able to get to that soul, to that self, to that divine will, to that spiritual STD. That's what you're mourning. That's what your despair is. He equates the soul to the self. I call it the soul, he calls it the self, or self-worth, or self-love. It's been said many different ways, the third chakra. Despair is a spiritual sickness. So he says there's 3 types of despair. He says inauthentic despair is ignorance that you don't know you have a self aside from finite reality. This is that recognition of people that think they're just material, they're just earthly. They don't even have sort of like an idea that there's a spiritual consciousness. So those people would probably be asleep. One of the things I forgot to mention about the Cain and Abel story is that Cain, after he killed Abel, his divine self, which is basically what Kierkegaard is saying, he had to wander into the land of Nod. He was a wanderer. Wanderer is someone who has no spiritual plan, no spiritual compass, no spiritual guidance. In the land of Nod, symbolic of low-level asleep consciousness. He was asleep. There are people that are asleep and don't even realize there's a spiritual nature. So that's what he calls inauthentic despair. The second is refusal to accept the self as infinite. You only address the material world and you don't even address your spirit. That's where most people are. We have 50% of ourself, even if we're in the guise of spirituality. Do not get, again, confused with the illusion and the form. In the guise of spirituality, you live in the finite world. You only meet your earthly desires. If you have to eat, sleep, poop, have sex every single day, earthly desires, go to work, pay your bills every day, what makes you think that you don't have to give the other aspect of yourself, which is your spirit, 50%? I say the 48 to 52. Both need attending to. And he's saying here, you're only attending to your finite self. Sartre had a similar concept called the bad self concept. He says that individuals act inauthentically by yielding to pressures of society to adopt false values and disown their freedom as sentient human beings. This is my theory of all of the value systems and the valor years and the spiritual striptease. You need to get down and dirty. When I say guilt is a placeholder emotion, that's what he's talking about. You don't feel guilty. You feel something less socially acceptable and you don't want to admit it, so you call it guilt. You're false and you're inauthentic and you're a fraud. Self is not constant. It can't be a thing in the world. This is what people struggle with. There's no right or wrong. There's no good or bad. There isn't strict guidelines on what to do. And so we say good and bad in moral terms. It's not. It's our value system. It's what we define. That's why step 4 in the 7 gates is define the need. It's linked to the value system. Judgments are confessions and they're great. It tells me what you value. Everything is gray in spirituality, and people don't like the gray areas. So part of the process of the 0 to 100, getting to that 48 to 52, is getting very comfortable with the gray, but having a container around it, having some boundaries and limits around that, what that looks like, and also using law of correspondence, everything is as a message so that you can see what the universe is guiding you with. We are guided. And my favorite is that all roles end. I said that before. All roles end. Everything has an expiration. Your wife, your mother, your employee, all of it. Because ultimately, the return back home to Venus in Truth 11 and 12 of my path is that you have to dethrone everything, even yourself, even your dogma, because love is beyond all of that. We're very, very far from that, but that is ultimately the goal of the divine feminine and the age of Aquarius. And then Kierkegaard says that his third is demonic despair. You know that you're earthly and divine, but you refuse to acknowledge your dependence on love. This is the divine feminine. This is the Aphrodite Urania. I struggle with this a lot. Like, I'm very confident in my self-worth. I know that I dedicate half my day or my life to my spiritual and my material, but I have so much trouble getting to that heart space of the soft corners of dethroning myself or my theories or my dogma. I'm so not there yet. That's okay. That is demonic despair. That's what made me cry this morning. Like, realizing that I'm so close to it. I'm seeing it. People at work are showing me this, and I'm still not there to able to touch it and get it yet. That's okay. That's the spiritual journey. It's the entire process of spirituality and a life is to get that. So Schopenhauer, Freud, and Thanatos. Freud and Schopenhauer both agree that death is the goal of life. Freud talked about a death drive that was self-destructive. My view on his view of the death drive is a little different, but I do believe that everybody has pain as pleasure or pleasure as pain as a death drive, basically an instinct to self-destruct. We are all self-destructive. We all want to reach a point of height and then take ourselves down from it. That's why when they say too big to fail or it's lonely at the top, you inevitably self-destruct because you haven't achieved that balance or build a team or realize the heart, realize the love, realize that you need others to sort of support you on your way up and that it's a team. And the interesting thing about when I was breaking down my values of teamwork, which is one of my big value systems, teamwork, you think, or leadership, my value of leadership is hierarchical, you think, but there's no hierarchy in the universe. So I had to bring it down to a cyclical thing. I had to bring it to teamwork rather than leadership. I can lead only by helping myself, healing myself, and then radiating those lessons out. So it was a struggle that I had personally, but all of us are self-destructive. Thanatos' goal of all death is life, which is the Saturn and the Pluto, is so that you truly live, so that you truly experience, and you truly get to the Aphrodite Urania, which is we're all the same. We're all cookie doughs, little clips of the cookie doughs doing divine work. And if we judge it, it's because it's a judgment in self. Thanatos is also a son of Nyx, that I mentioned earlier, the night, and carries you off into the underworld. So Thanatos has 7 siblings. So when you're talking about grief and despair, you're talking about these. These are earthly siblings. So in the grief, if you're suffering because you're getting old or old age, if you're suffering because it's suffering, which Buddha said suffering is optional, if you're creating or feeling doom, if you're feeling or creating deception, if you're creating or feeling blame, which goes with shame, if you're feeling or creating strife or retribution, these are linked to grief. These are the siblings of grief. And these are the things that you're feeling in terms of your grief in your earthly consciousness. The spiritual consciousness is despair and doesn't have these, so that you can relate those to one another. So I want to talk a little bit about Jesus. What's so special about Jesus? When I pose this in my classes, people kind of stumble. What's so special about Jesus? Well, Jesus was God, right? But so are you. And what's so ordinary about Jesus? That he's in a body of a man, and so are you. And so people come and they're like, oh, Jesus, Jesus. I had a client the other day. I'm like, you love Jesus because you are Jesus. You are divine and you are ordinary. This is the whole trick. This is what we don't want to reconcile. And we are Jesus. Jesus simply was a man that understood his self-worth and then learned the lesson of compassion, love, and empathy and gave it back to the world, just like Buddha. That's why these traditions are rooted in that. We think that we can get there from the heart without doing the second and third steps or the second and third chakra. Impossible. You have to understand your lower nature, your possessive, greedy, lustful nature in the second. Your third chakra of self-worth, that you think you are God, you are a narcissist, no other cookie dough has ever been needed, to then get to the fourth. That's why Kierkegaard calls it the despair, because it's very hard. If you actually get out of the second to the third, purify the diamond and live in your brilliance, then now you have to give all that to every other person that you assume is low-level consciousness, that you think is less than you. I struggle with this all day, every day. This is going to be the rest of my life, trying to get to this point. I'm divine, I'm human, but in a container. That's what Jesus and Buddha did that we struggle with, not because we're not Jesus. Jesus died on the cross. The 2-8 axis in astrology is the cross of possessions, of values, of death. You must kill. And I don't like that something must die in you to remember who you are, in the sense of killing, because we learned in the Hydra that you cannot kill. You bring it to the light. But something must be resurrected. Your value system, your false values of your parents, own your own values. What you judge, your low-level consciousness, your animal nature, that must come to the light, quote unquote, be killed. So in the 8th house, you're resurrected. That's the story of the hanged man in tarot. That's the story of Jesus. He was simply modeling to us, and Jesus was an astrologer and a shaman and a metaphysician and all these things, because he's teaching us alchemy. He's teaching us what we have to do to exchange grief for despair, or earthly consciousness for divine consciousness, and be both. It's an exchange of values. Human values, I said, are lust, greed, envy, power, money. We need these things. This is part of our earthly dynamic. This is part of our earthly body. We have these things, acknowledging them, but not letting them overpower. Give Caesar's what is Caesar's, the human values. Give God's what is God's, the spiritual values. You're going to have grief when you lose things, but own that you're a utilitarian. Own that it's use, and then do your despair, which is figure out why you're so hopeless, figure out why you are so sad that you left the universal consciousness, and do your divine work. And then those two are balanced. The only way to do that, the only way to sort of navigate despair and work through that, is to set boundaries, limitations, the 48 to 52, saying no, recognizing you're not a savior or a rescuer for anyone. It's very lonely to acknowledge you don't need anyone. Not that you don't need people, because that's ultimately the key home, right? The Aphrodite, Urania, the Venus, the love, the compassion, everybody's a mirror, everyone's modeling for you. It's lonely to acknowledge that you've been seeking unmet needs from other people that isn't really true. You don't need anybody. There's only one real unmet need, and it's sex. That's the whole thing with the prostitute and the demons at the earthly level, at the low vibration level. I spoke to you last week about Lilith and Mary Magdalene at the high vibration level. So what happens when you don't need anyone? What happens when you meet your own needs? What happens when you have to stop asking for permission? What happens when you're just an adult? It could be very lonely. And the spiritual literature says that. So I see that people that are spiritual aspirants and on the Christ consciousness and on the spiritual path are pebbles in one another's path. I'm simply a pebble on your path. If any of this serves you, great. If not, it's always been for me. I have never denied that what I understand, what I teach is for me. And if you get something of it, great. I'm a pebble, and go to the next and go to the next. And it's yours. It's your journey. So I need to talk to you about narcissism in the Age of Aquarius. In the Age of Pisces, our narcissistic tendencies and admission was squashed. Jesus was the savior. We could not admit that we were narcissists. We labeled narcissistic personality disorder. It's true, a thing. Basically, narcissists, their parents told them they were God, pretended to meet their needs, and pretended to love them unconditionally. Most of us were the opposite. We were the pauper. Those people were the prince, and we were the pauper. At the bottom of the ocean, like Hephaestus, who knew he was a god, but wasn't acknowledged that his needs were going to get met, wasn't given unconditional love. And so we squashed our narcissism in the pretend, in the guise of loving thy neighbor, of, oh, I feel bad, or oh, this, oh, that. And it's all a lie. So in the Age of Aquarius, let's just really get comfortable and clear that we are all divine, which makes us narcissists, because how do you not be? How do you not have pride? How do you not have hubris if you're the divine cookie dough? I mean, that's just really hard. And most of us hate our body or self-destruct our body because we think we're beyond the body and that we should be out of the body. So we're all narcissists. The Age of Aquarius is going to create a lot of narcissists. I've talked to you about my false prophets. When Neptune leaves Pisces, there's going to be a lot of toppling of false prophets. There's going to be continuation of people, what I call post-it note or sticky note spirituality, selling truths that are not truths. I've got to resign and let back. I was checked yesterday real quick. The world's got to do what the world's got to do. And Francis's narcissism got real checked. So I got to let it flow and just do me, you know? So it's like a constant reminder that I am not God because I am a narcissist. So it's a good constant check, you know? But admission of it allows you to do the work in the divine, which I think is how I got to my spiritual STD. But now, of course, toppling even that as I get deeper into the spiritual truths. So narcissism is the realization that you think you're all powerful. This is very scary. And the thing is, what would people think if they actually think you thought this about yourself? And more importantly, what would you do to prove that you're God? What would you stop at? Probably not much. Maybe killing someone? That's scary to think, the capacity that you have. So the New Age has brought in all these terms, other ways to say you're narcissist, and I've got to dethrone this because it's just nonsense. So there was a book called Gods of Aquarius by Brad Steiger, and he introduced people as reptiles, half reptiles, star seeds, indigo children, walk-ins, alien human hybrids. I see this in practice all the time. This is another way of saying, I am not human. I am beyond the body. I am beyond this consciousness. I am more than. No, you're not. You are simply human. Human and divine like Jesus. Human and divine like all of us. You're the universal cookie dough and you're the little plop of cookie dough on the pan. We have got to get out of this idea that we're more than what we are. That is so narcissistic, creating categories of people so that you feel special, so that you feel separate. That's just ego. It's separate despair. The minute you're born, you feel separated from the womb. That's another way of feeling separate from the universal consciousness, because now there's another planet and another galaxy and another. You cannot escape the law. Everything falls in the law. Law of correspondence says. There's no such thing as chance. There's no such thing as luck. The principle of mentalism, which we can't understand, is that everything is covered by an energetic field, an energetic consciousness. All things fall in there. But here we are wanting to create categories of people. This is nonsense. Absolutely not. Being God isn't enough. Being divine isn't enough. Being Jesus isn't enough. So what I say is, well, if Jesus gets a virgin, Jesus gets a star, Jesus gets a manger, Jesus gets a holiday, hell, why can't you? Of course you need to invent a category of person. Jesus gets a story, you need a story that big. If you're Jesus, of course it makes sense. But we gotta stop with the crazy stories. You are here to save yourself. That is it. That is it. That was the best thing for me. I heal no one. I'm a healer for no one. I do nothing for anyone else. I can barely do it for myself. I'm at this 24/7, 24/7. Everything's a message, everything. I got to go to the drawing board all the time. My friends, family are tired of this because I'm constantly like, oh, I saw this, or I saw this. I got to work on this. It's a full-time job. I have no time to help anybody else. Let's stop with the crazy stories and inventing categories of people. Just admit you're a narcissist. You come from the universal consciousness. You are divine. You are Jesus, just like Jesus. He's no different than you. He just did the steps. That's it. Stop crucifying yourself on a cross. All he did was kill what needed to kill himself. Stop possessing what he needed to possess and keep walking. His disciples fell asleep. He had to keep going. He left his mother and he's got to do my Father's work. You're here to do your divine work. Stop with your expired roles and your identity linked to self-worth that isn't true. And don't add more reptile starseed walk-in nonsense. It's just nonsense. Your story is great enough as it is. So we're all narcissists. We don't want to admit it. We self-hate and self-betray to simply show the world that we're human, even though we deep down say, well, I'm not human. I'm better than everybody else. No one sees that. Of course, we all see it. This is the judgment. And then in terms of children, for those of you who are parents or are planning to be parents, this is not about telling your kid that he's so great and so great and so great. That just turns you into a narcissistic personality disorder, which is just as bad. That's the Aries to the Hephaestus. It's just as bad. It's just don't make them meet your needs. That's the trick. Don't make your kids meet your needs. Cook, clean, and counsel yourself. So this brings me to toxic masculinity, because we always hear about toxic masculinity. I've said this before, but I have to reiterate because it leads me to sort of the end all be all, which is the balance of spirit and matter and what Jesus and Buddha taught. Toxic masculinity is simply the masculine principle, the ego, the validation, the proving. There's one word I hear a lot in practice. I can't win. I can never win. Let's say it's in a couple. Or competition. It's like if this is a competition. The other day someone said to me, you mean I didn't win? I don't win anything for acknowledging that I'm low-level consciousness? No. Yeah, you win in yourself. You figured it out. Now go to the next thing. This never ends. Not even your last breath. You go to the plane in the universe, you hang out there for a while, and you come back and do it again. This idea of winning or spirituality, something to be win or someone more spiritual than another. So, and I struggle with this too. This isn't that I don't deal with these things, but it's like you're competitive. I'm better. I have to win. That's where judgments are linked to. And it's all self-worth. It's all low self-worth. You think having a medal, money, a person, a job, me going on Oprah's couch, like validates us. It's not. This isn't a competition. This is just your spiritual growth. This is you getting back home to that cookie dough that you long for, that you're in such despair over, that you possess other people and grieve over. So it's not about that. That's what toxic masculinity is. Now, because the law says, as within, so without, we have now created this world of toxic masculinity, of bullies, of girl bosses, of all of this ego, because it's in us, because we were taught that we're not enough. So the divine feminine is the balance to that. You have to have your ego. You have to have your drive. You have to have a divine purpose, of course, but balance that with the divine feminine. The body is the earth element. It's the only vehicle to express God. When I really understood this head to heart, I stopped destroying my body. I take care of it. I'm not saying that it's easy to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go to the gym. And of course I want to eat sugar and not only healthy foods. That's not what that's about. That's a 0 to 100. to 48 to 52. It's nourishing and taking body and having some self-care of this vehicle that houses my divine. How lucky am I that God gave me this body, that I have to be in limited form to express that divine nature in his light, in his vision. I get to do it my way. How much more special is that? Nobody looks like me. Nobody has this spark. That is individuation. That is divine, but in an earthly limited form. So instead of getting sick mentally or physically, or fat or unhealthy, or having an illness, or having a GI disorder, or having a broken toe, whatever it is that you utilize your body to sort of unprove or disprove that you're God, just own it. Go beyond the crucifixion. Stop crucifying. It's all happening here, and your body is manifesting it all. I could see your body and know exactly the war zone you have in your psyche. There's two types of diseases. There are diseases that are small, or the shrinking type. This is you trying to erase, that nobody identify that you think you're God. You play small. And then there are gluttony diseases, or big diseases, or growth diseases, which was what I had: cancer, abnormal growth of the cells, crayons outside the lines. I'm so bigger than what I'm pretending to be. And that's the narcissism either way. Neither way is healthy. So how do we, through form, through our eyes, have God? How in this limited earthly form do we actually view God and enjoy the form? Because if Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden because of their rational thinking, and what came through their eyes was that the apples look so good, and form and illusion is our demise, we weren't given eyes to rip them out. I don't agree with the myths in that sense. I know it's metaphorical. So we use our eyes for beauty, to experience God through the senses. You're gonna have your lustful, gluttonous, envious, greedy senses, but the other 50%, the divine nature, balance that with the Muses. The Muses were the daughters of the Titans, the animal nature, the low-level consciousness, and children of Zeus, the god of all gods. So your divine and your animal nature are reconciled through the use of the Muses. There's 9. Calliope, she ruled epic poetry, song, and dance. Clio ruled history. Euterpe ruled the flutes and music. Thalia ruled comedy. Melpomene, my favorite, tragedy. I love to go to Broadway and see theater and the tragedy and read the myths. Terpsichore, dance. I love to dance. Eroto, what if you love erotic poetry and erotic love? That's fine. Go to the Erotic Museum in Miami Beach. It's phenomenal. Polyhymnia, sacred dance, hymn, agriculture, pantomime, and of course, Urania, astronomy. So there are, through the senses, the way to use the body to not self-destruct. Honor your vices. Honor that. That's your earthly consciousness. Don't grieve when something's taken from you, because you can get something else. You're in a constant state of that. But use your senses for love, for growth, for spirituality. And it's the Muses, it's the senses which we experience God. I think it was Joseph Campbell who said that poets and artists are the modern day philosophers, as they experience these teachings through their music, through their song, through their poems. That's what we need. We need to get reignited with these beautiful things that the earthly world provides and get out of the disaster. So some ways that you can apply this, if you're a student in terms of counseling, or if you're watching as just, a layperson, what's your birth story? Your birth story, remember, is linked to transitions, can be linked directly to that disruptor that you're going to create, to that grief that's going to take you to delusional despair. Ask about your first transition, your first sex, your first move, your first maybe going to school from one school to another, maybe you move cities or countries. How did your mother take care of you? The way that your mother took care of you when you were sick, it could be your father too, is the way that you will nurture yourself. And so if you allowed yourself to have a day off, then maybe you use sickness to prove you're not lazy, for instance. What's the first time you got away with something? This is what you think is like in your head, that you're getting away with something. It's linked to liberty in the video I did on the freedom and the price you pay. First time something ended abruptly, no closure, a sudden ending. This was a Pluto, a disruptor. They could have had it been at a young age, but you'll repeat those patterns, and then you'll call it God, or you'll be a victim or a perpetrator or the other. This is really important. Define a situation where there was a perpetrator, a victim, and a rescuer. See where you put yourself. Do you put yourself as the rescuer? Do you put yourself as the victim of the situation? This really gives insight to yourself or your client. Is there God? Is there a curse? Is there someone else that they're giving all the credit to? We give away our power all the time. That's why I'm in this dethroning series. Stop putting people on thrones. It's you, it's your throne. Check with yourself, mom and dad. Every single person placed in your situation is representative of mother and your father. Your father and your mother gave you some limitations, and you have to work within that. But stop giving and putting everyone on a pedestal. No one deserves to be there. If the client or yourself views God or some entity as a rescuer, you might be an idealist, you might be an escape artist, you're waiting to be saved, and you don't take personal responsibility. The psychological homeostasis wants to stay in pretend or innocence, or pretend to be innocent, and wants others to take control. That's why we say God saved us, or this person harmed us. Stop waiting for your savior and stop with the magical thinking. You are the magic. So I call them the thieves. They're called the deadly sins or the repus. There's many ways that they've been called, and I kind of want to wrap up this term about forensics and the crime with this. Pride. Pride is called like the deadliest of all sins. Why? Because we're all narcissists. It's like, how do I not have pride? So we squash our pride and we call it pride when really it's just self-worth. Of course you're going to have despair. You are God. But you create a Lucifer. Remember, Lucifer thought that he could do it better than God. And you create a Lucifer, Pluto, or all the number of different names I gave for this month to do your spiritual work. Greed. Greed is directly linked with grief. This is an earthly thing. You know no other way to get to despair. So you lose. Remember, greed is having something, a possession. You lose that. It lost utility, but you couldn't own that it lost utility. So you create grief to lead you to despair. Maybe we could skip that step. Wrath. Of course you're angry. How can you not have angry? You were kicked out of the universal consciousness. But there's two types of wrath. There's the 0 wrath and the 100 wrath. The Old Testament wrath of God, really wrathful God, or the New Testament, which is Jesus. This is your power currency. Are you aggressive, assertive, absolutely bold and loud and aggressive and take your power? Or are you passive, aggressive, manipulative, and coercive? Either way, it's wrath. Gluttony. You aren't allowed to truly say, think, and do, so you swallow your thoughts. You're in a constant force to be gluttonous because you're not allowed because of conventional and societal norms. So you've got to swallow your emotions, thoughts, and desires. Envy and jealousy towards those that can do their spiritual work. Some of us were given permission, and others have to create a lot of nonsense to even get to the spiritual realm. If you're someone whose parents validated, let's say, intellect and no spirituality, not to say you didn't go to church, but the God in your home was money, or the God in your home was brilliance and intelligence, then of course you're going to envy those people that get to do spiritual work more outwardly. It's so ironic. And sloth. Sloth is spiritual laziness. We're all sloths. I've said this before, everyone knows I love Pitbull, and he can't own his sloth. He always talks about hard work. He's talking about hard work in the sense that he works, but we're all sloths. If 50% of our day, our time, our calendar, our money, our time and resources is supposed to be spent on spirituality, everyone's a sloth. It's only when you start using the law of correspondence 24/7, living in both consciousness, your earthly and your spiritual. I say I'm a shaman, not because I'm shamanic, even though I do shamanic practices, is because it just means live between the worlds. I'm in the earthly realm and connected to the spirit. I'm in the earthly connected to the spirit. It's a constant flow. And when you live in that, I personally think law of correspondence is heavenly for that. then you can constantly be doing, doing spiritual work. But most of us are spiritual sloths. So lastly, I want to wrap up with Aristotle's virtues and vices. So he talks about this in his book, Nicomachean Ethics. And I kind of like it because it goes a little bit more in depth. Instead of like the 0 to 100 or the Enneagram sort of has similar vices and virtues. Of course, Catholicism, vices and virtues, and the deadly sins, the Ripus are the thieves of the mind, and Jainism and Hinduism. This kind of gives us a 0, 100, 48 to 52. So the virtue is the 48 to 52. And here's the excess, and here's deficiency. So you can see like what you're working on. I'm very much working on truthfulness and patience, friendliness. So I always check myself, and I'm always like, oh, okay, I was a little too boastful in big issue of mine. I'm a little too boastful in that one. I need to get, so I don't want to be too super understated, because understatement was what I did for so long, and I played small. So that's the 0. But the boastful might be the excess of the fire, the excess that you're God, that you're divine. Yeah, you recognize it, but living in the truth, mainly, of course, all with yourself. The wittiness, I don't want to be a buffoon. I was a clown for a very long time, I felt. So balancing that. Cantankerous. I was a cranky person. I don't want to be that, but I don't want to also flatter you with manipulation. So friendliness. What's friendly? Like this chart, I really find that helps us identify that gray area, that 48 to 52. And you're going to have your own definitions of what they are, and you're going to have your own virtues that you want to work on. They're not the same all the time, every moment of your life. You might be working on one. Maybe right now you're working on courage. Like I'm a person that has a lot of courage, but I do tend to lean towards rashness rather than cowardice. So I've got to watch that. So depending on the situation, I just think that this chart sort of sums up the 0 to 100 and the 48 to 52 in a really good way. So after you've had your spiritual striptease, after you've grieved, once you've gone into despair, this is kind of how you heal it. You identify at every moment using the law of correspondence how you're going to sort of check in with yourself and say, oh, that situation showed up with that conversation. Oh, that showed up. Oh, maybe that's the universe telling me this, so that you can balance, like Jesus and Buddha, the earthly and divine. Please stop playing small. Please stop not owning your fire. Please stop destroying your body, which is the divine container. It's really such a beautiful space to be in. I don't have all the answers, and I'm only on truth 9 of my 12-step model, when 10, 11, and 12 are the hardest. So who the hell knows? But these are the lessons that I've learned. These are the theories that I've developed from my own clients, from my own lived experience. And I really, really hope that this can lead you not only to your prostitute and your spiritual striptease, and most importantly, what I'm trying to achieve is the Uranian Venus, the space of heart, where I can have a little bit more, or at least a balance of the soft corners and the hard edges, as I say, because I really struggle, and I'm always with the hard edges, and I'm always in that space. And this is eternity. This is forever. This isn't anything to win. This isn't competitive. You're not going to have the answer one day and that's it and it's done. It's a 24/7 process, so that's just sort of where I'm at. These are the theories that I've developed, that I understand. This is a book that I'm writing called The Wisdom of the Psyche. And I hope that these teachings teach you something, and that you can walk away with something. Thank you.